when you're out in your community and you're talking about the company that you used to work for and the way that your team rallied, and you smile and you're filled with love and compassion for them and gratitude because of the way that you were treated, that signals to people, this is a company that I should do business with. There's a reputational benefit to compassionate leadership and compassionate business practices.
You just lost your loved one. Now what? Welcome to the Grief in Life podcast, where we explore this new reality through grief-colored lenses. Openly, authentically, I'm your host, Nina Rodriguez. Let's get started.
Today's guest, Janet Gwilliam-Wright, is a grief awareness advocate and educator. She launched the Mother Love Project in 2020 as a platform for motherless daughters, marking the 25th anniversary of her mother's death. Since launching the project, over 150 women from around the world have shared their stories. Janet is also co-founder of Bloomwell Partners, a global training and consulting firm working to build more compassionate and grief-informed workspaces, one organization at a time. She has 20 years experience leading large organizational change initiatives. She is a wealth of information, and I am honored to welcome Janet to the Grief and Light podcast.
Hi, it's so nice to see you. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I was so excited to be here.
Thank you so much for being here, and happy early Mother's Day to you. We are recording a little bit before Mother's Day. This episode will release right before Mother's Day, so I wanted to wish you a happy Mother's Day.
Thank you. It's a big day in our culture, isn't it?
It is. We're honoring those key figures in our lives, including your mother. So if you could just tell the listeners what's her name and start with who she was and how she influenced your life.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Such a huge way. I appreciate so much the opportunity to talk about her because, as you know, when our person dies, the longer we get from that passing, we're asked about them less and we get to say their name less. And it's just so important to me to be able to talk about her. Her name was Cassandra. Everybody called her Cass. Some people called her Mama Cass after the mamas and the papas because she just took care of everybody. She was very warm and kind and a beautiful friend and a mentor to a lot of women and men too, but a lot of women. She was an advertising executive in the 1980s, which is, if anyone's ever seen Mad Men, you get a little bit of that flavor. She was the vice president and creative director of a very large advertising agency. And I thought she walked on water. She was larger than life, and she was the center of our family, as many women are. So, that was a bit about my mom.
Well, thank you. We'll dedicate this episode to Cass and to all the moms that we're celebrating. If you have a mother in your life that is with us in person or in spirit, either way, we celebrate them and their presence in our lives. So Cass sounds like a pioneer for her time. She was a businesswoman and Mama Cass. She was a motherly figure, but she's also the pioneer in her time and her day. She is somebody that sounds very admirable. So thank you for sharing that with us. And unfortunately, we're also here because she no longer with us. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1990, and I was 13. And so really at that time, there wasn't a ton of awareness about breast cancer. And so, she went through her treatments and got all the treatment that she could. And we thought, okay, we got it. She's good. We always talk about that 5-year remission period, and she was just shy of it. So when I was 17, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it had re-diagnosed, and it had spread to her liver. It was very aggressive when it came back, as is often the case, and she lived for another year. So she died on the day I graduated from high school. I was 18, and it was June 17th, 1995, which is why I launched the Mother Love Project on June 17th, 2020. That was the 25th anniversary of her death.
I understand that when you found out you were graduating, you were in the middle of your graduation ceremony, so it was a bit of a shock, and it was a very pivotal moment in your life, not just because of the loss, but because of the changes in your life. You were going to college. Essentially, it's when we become young adults, and
Yes.
unfortunately, that had to be with this major disruption to your life?
I have often said that was the day that my life imploded. My life was never the same after that day. I have my before me and my after me. And I had to keep going. I was accepted at university, and I was bound and determined to go. I wasn't going to, for better or worse, let anything derail my plans. My mom had wanted me to go away to university. That was something that was important to her. She'd had that experience as a young person. So I did go away in that I went a little bit down the road, but I did live in residence, and I had that on-campus experience. And really, I think that that's what saved me in those early years after my mom's death. I had a group of friends from high school and new friends that I'd made at the University of British Columbia, where I went, and they rallied. They surrounded me with love and kindness and support, and let me cry and let me talk about her and process my emotions. And I think that that really, in those early months and years, really kept me going.
Community is so key in processing grief. And for context, we were talking, this is in the 1990s. So the conversations weren't necessarily as open as they are nowadays. We have gotten so lucky to be in a space now where through social media, we're able to have these more open conversations. And still, we have a very long way to go. At the same time, you also didn't have that full support as you perhaps would have today. So it, from my understanding, it impacted your life quite a bit. And, tell us a little bit about how that fundamentally helped define who you are today.
Absolutely. I like to remind people that when my mom died in 1995, the internet didn't exist. Right? We didn't have email. There were very few resources available in my community. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia. What I had was Hope Edelman's book, Motherless Daughters. And that book made a huge difference in my life. As soon as I read it, it was released in 94. And I remember somebody gave it to me and said, I think that you will really benefit from this book. And I read it cover to cover, probably in a day. I just devoured it. And it showed me I'm not alone. There are other women out there who are like me. And what I'm going through, what I'm feeling is very common and to be expected. And that brought me enormous comfort in those days and weeks and months after my mom died. I had the help of a therapist. She didn't label herself as a grief therapist, but that's exactly what she did. She worked with a lot of people who were in palliative care, whose family members were dying. That was her area of expertise. And my mom had started to see her before she died because of her diagnosis. And then my brother and I had seen her as well. So I continued to see her. I didn't have any money to pay for therapy. So one of my mom's friends actually paid for therapy for me, which was just such a lifeline at that time. And, I unfortunately, but fortunately for me, I had two very close friends whose parents had also died a couple of years before mine. And so we had this bond. We knew what the other person was feeling and what they were going through. And so I really leaned into my community, but at the same time, I became such a workaholic, such a perfectionist. Everything I did, I threw myself into my schoolwork because that was the only coping mechanism I really had at that time. My anxiety was through the roof. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire. And so I just worked and worked and worked and worked. And I drank a lot. I was a first-year university student, and so nobody really batted an eye. But looking back on it now, it was just to numb those feelings of sadness and hopelessness and desperation. I didn't know how to cope with the loss of not only my mom, but the loss of my family, the loss of my home, the loss of the life that I had for 18 years. It just poof, vanished overnight.
And the pain in those early days is so brutal that we just want to get it under control. We just want to have a moment to breathe. So I have so much compassion for that. that version of you that had to go through something, even though it sounds like you had wonderful community and resources. There's a level of loneliness that at the end of the day, you go to sleep and you're there with yourself and your thoughts and the reality of it all. And, so it's very heavy. I also hear you when you say you had this therapist that knew your mother and also your brother. So there was a bit of continuity there. And I would like to ask you, what makes somebody a grief therapist? Like, what is the difference between, for a lack of a better word, a regular therapist versus a grief-informed therapist?
Yeah, such a great question. And I had no language for this when I was 18 that I have now. So looking back on it, it's really powerful because this amazing woman's name is Janie Brown. She's from Vancouver. She's a trained nurse. She's written a beautiful book about grief and her work with the dying. So I encourage anyone to Google Janie. She's such a magical person. I think what makes her grief informed is her connection to death and dying, is that her whole practice has been informed by work with the dying, work with the family members of people who are dying. And I think that grief informed practice around being in palliative care units, sitting with people who are dying, sitting with people who are watching their loved ones die, that is so profound. And I wouldn't want to speak for her, but certainly when it came to me, I think that she really encouraged me to explore the feelings, all of the feelings that I had about my mother's death, because they were so complicated. They were so complex. They were confusing. I was so confused all the time. Why am I angry? Why am I resentful? Why do I feel guilty? I think when she died, and this is so common, especially with mothers, we sanctify them, right? They become saints. We can't, and even people will say, well, don't speak ill of the dead. Well, sometimes we want to. Because if there are parents and they made mistakes, there are complicated feelings and memories that we need to explore. So I think that's what really Janie helped me to do in my sort of 18-year-old brain, was try to process the trauma that I was experiencing, but also to understand that I was allowed to have these other emotions that I didn't think I should be feeling. And I think that's what made her grief informed, in my view.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. We guilt ourselves so much into how we, quote unquote, should be feeling after loss. And thank you for emphasizing this point. Loss is nuanced, it's complicated, it's layered. Humans are complicated, nuanced, and layered. So loss is going to be a reflection of that. And it's not to say that we're only going to say bad things, but we are dealing with imperfect humans, ourselves included, the person that we lost. And the reality of it, I had this conversation with another guest on the podcast, and she said there's so much freedom in being able to speak the full truth of our experience with this person, whether they're with us or not. And that full truth can be so liberating. Some people use the word healing. It could help us move forward in very powerful ways. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you started the Mother Love Project in 2020. Tell us what that was like. That year was the year that everybody in the world remembers quite vividly.
Yeah, it was the third month of lockdown. Like many people, I was working around the clock, and I could see in the distance this anniversary coming. And I realized, wow, it's been 25 years. What a milestone, a quarter of a century. That felt so profound to me. And I really felt like I needed to do something public. I had never spoken about my grief publicly before. Well, not once. And I really wanted to share my story because I thought, if I've got a story to tell, I want to memorialize my mom, in all of her fullness, but also represent my experience as a motherless daughter. Maybe there are other motherless daughters out there who might want to do this. Some of them were my friends. I sort of poked them and said, I have this idea. What do you think? And they said, yes, do it. And I was in the shower one day where I get some of my best ideas. And
that's source before idea.
Right?
That's
a good idea. Why. I just was like, it should be the Mother Love Project. I don't know where that came from. Still to this day, I don't know. But I was like, yeah, that's a good title. I like that. went on Squarespace and was like, okay, I'll just figure it out. Got the handle on Instagram and I posted a story. And I said, if you have a story that you would like to share, send me a message and I will post it. And I waited. I sort of held my breath a little bit like, oh my gosh, this may have been a mistake. I don't know. And then women from all over the world, it was phenomenal. Women reached out to me on Instagram and said, I want to share my story. Here are the pictures of my mom and me and my grandmother. I mean, just the most beautiful, loving, complicated, amazing tributes. It's a living memorial. It's a living testament to our mothers. It's something that we can point to and say, here she is, world, and here's her name, and this is my story. And I think for a long time, Nina, honestly, I felt like I had this giant hole in my heart that just would never close. It would never heal. And I think with every story I post and every interaction I have with women, I think that hole gets a little bit smaller because I'm so filled with love and gratitude. I'm so filled with joy. I'm so filled with connection and community. These are women I've never met. I'll probably never meet them in person. And yet I feel so connected to them. I know about their families. I know about their grief. It truly is an honor to do this work. It's been beautiful.
It is beautiful work, and there's so much power in sharing our stories. I am a huge believer in that for ourselves and for each other, and to get through life, because whatever you're feeling, another person's feeling their version of that, and sharing these stories is incredibly powerful and has a beautiful ripple effect in impossibly beautiful ways that we will probably never know the end result of. I love that you created this sacred space for other women to honor their mother. We, as grievers, love any opportunity to say their name and to talk about them and honor them the way that we remember them. So how beautiful. So it started with this page, and are you doing something in honor of Mother's Day? I'm guessing it would be. We are.
Yeah. We are. So on Thursday, we're doing a community call, and this is something that I started last year, where we did community events and just came together in a circle and shared and journaled and reflected and did some breathing exercises. And we're doing a community call again this Thursday night. If people would like to join us, it's a really safe space. It's a peer group, and it's a wonderful way to connect with other women who have had a similar experience. Yeah.
If somebody wanted more information, they wanted to participate, how can they do that?
So you can go to the website, motherloveproject.com. So motherloveproject is all one.com, and then click on the events page, and you'll see the registration is there, and there's some information about the date and time and sort of the setup of the event. Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. We'll link that in the show notes. And if feeling that this information resonates with you, I highly encourage you to join the space. A lot of people get intimidated by the idea of joining a group of people who you technically don't know. But I always find that the magic about connecting in grief, it's like we're already in this really bizarre space, but the magic of it is that there's no mask, there's no representative. It's just purely each other's essence connecting in very profound ways with people that also understand that the women who participate are from literally all over the world, correct?
Yeah. So mostly the women who have joined us have been from Canada and the US. Just because of the time zone. We're in Eastern time zone. But definitely I've had women from the UK reach out and say, oh, this is great. I can make this time because it's, 10 o'clock in England, 5 o'clock here. We welcome all experiences. It's really important, as you say, the magic is in that connection. It's that, oh, I see you, I get it. I feel what you're saying. And so much similarity, and I just think real community, real camaraderie is felt. It's pretty amazing, I have to say.
It's pretty special. One interesting dynamic that could feel very painful in grief, and a lot of grievers will understand this, is sometimes the people we thought would be there during the most difficult time in our lives not only disappear, some more often than not through no fault of their own, they will say the wrong things. They will do very hurtful things, because part of the reason we're having these conversations is that we live in a very grief averse society that because of our aversion to big feelings, big emotions, tough conversations, we get it wrong more often than not. We end up unintentionally, most of the time, hurting other people, hurting each other. So the power of these groups and these conversations and these spaces like the Mother Love Project is that you're with people who get it, and you're finding the support in a complete stranger that sometimes feels more like long lost family, if you will, than a complete stranger.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. You just find this instant connection. It's so true. I think, as you say, we live in a grief-phobic society, and we're so isolated in our grief. And what grief requires is community, is connection, is ritual, is the externalized expression of our grief. And we so often are denied that in our culture. And so, this is exactly the space to get that kind of validation, for sure.
I love it. But that's not all. You also are co-founder of Bloomwell Partners. For my listeners who have been here a while and might have heard a previous episode with Dr. Mikkel Harris, Janet and Dr. Mikkel founded Bloomwell Partners, which is a global training and consulting firm building more compassionate and grief-informed workspaces. And I love this mission so much. I love this, because one of the most difficult things for a griever to do is go back to work. I had a dear friend, for example. She unfortunately had a pregnancy loss, a stillbirth to be more specific. So
I'm so sorry.
I know, I felt it's been very, life-changing for her. And she says one of the most difficult moments in her life was these 9 months where your coworkers are excited for you. You might have even got to the baby shower. They are asking you for the name. They're in this journey with you. And suddenly you return after way too short of a time, because grief leave is borderline non-existent. And she said it was the most shocking, painful, and surreal thing. And coworkers didn't know how to talk to her, so they avoided the topic altogether. So this is just one example of so many different ways that grief is quite frankly mishandled at the workspace. So tell us about your work with Bloomwell Partners, and what is the mission, and how you're helping grievers.
Yeah, no, thank you. So my dear friend, business partner, as you say, your previous guest, Dr. Mikkel Harris, who is a licensed psychologist based in Memphis, Tennessee. She and I co-founded Bloomwell Partners last year. And our mission is to build more compassionate organizations, one workplace at a time. And we mean it. We are so mission driven. I think, as you say, one of the most difficult transitions for anyone who's experienced significant loss is going back to work. If you're a working age person in North America, even around the world, you will typically get 48 hours, maybe 72, if you're lucky, of unpaid leave. That is atrocious. Anyone experiencing that loss and having to go back into a professional work environment is going to experience probably some pretty significant anxiety about doing that. I have managed managers for a long time. I'm a leader in my organization. I've been an executive for many years, and this is just something that managers are simply not trained to do. They are not well equipped. We put them in these situations with enormous complexity and then say, go ahead, deal with it, but we won't train you. We're not going to give you any supports or any resources to do that. And what we find from the data is that people really have one of two experiences when they return to work, either amazing or absolutely terrible. There's very little room in between. And so the people who have this amazing experience, they have managers that are leading with passion, they're leading with their humanity, they're leading with connection, support. How can I help you? What can we do? Let's rally. All of this happens. It's a very much a bonding experience for a team, building trust. That's that manager. Then we have most managers who do not do this because they don't know how. They're not well equipped. They don't have the emotional intelligence or the communication skills to be able to extend that hand that's really essential. So there's really two parts to what we do. One is a consulting function. We help organizations build grief-informed cultures through policies and practices. The other part is training. We do grief education in the workplace. We also do training for managers and leaders. So this is anybody from C-suite right down to, up floor steward, somebody who's a team lead, anybody who's responsible for the management of other people in the workplace. That's who we work with. But we also do grief education with employees, and just a phenomenal experience because every organization we go into, they say, "Oh my gosh, we're so happy you're here. We've been wanting to do this for so long." We get phenomenal feedback because people are so happy that they get to actually talk about grief at work. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
It sounds like it's very holistic too. So you assess the needs of the particular company and how they work with their employees, and you provide the training accordingly, which is very powerful. Right. And this training, what does it look like? Is it a module? How does it work?
Yeah, so we have a variety of trainings that we offer. We can do workshops, webinars. It really depends on the needs of the organization. So holistically, we talk about the learning needs of the organization. Our framework is a 6-part framework, and it's live training with Mikkel and I. We go through our 6-part framework, and we have monthly coaching calls. This is really where the magic happens. So managers will often say to us, "Oh, your theory is amazing. We love what you're saying, but gosh, I just don't know what to say. What do I say? What do I do? What are these small things that I can do?" And so we take managers on a monthly basis through live coaching calls where we talk about issues, we talk through practical strategies, we role playing, and we give feedback. And it's so rich, and it's a really impactful experience because, as we know, adult learners, they need to put into practice what they've learned to make it effective. So that's really how we've designed our program, and we've gotten some really fantastic feedback.
That's very powerful, and that's very helpful because we truly collectively don't have the words. And there are words. There are things that can be more than others, and there are ways to support grievers. And also, grief doesn't necessarily have to be due to the loss of a person. It could also be different types of grief. So what kind of griefs can you address, for example, through these trainings other than the loss of a person?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you. We always start all of our presentations by saying in our culture, we talk about grief as the death of a family member or friend. When we talk about grief, we're talking about divorce, the loss of a home, the grief that people feel about climate change, climate disasters, natural disasters, the death of a pet, infertility, pregnancy loss. When we talk about grief, we often talk about the hierarchy of grief, sort of what is acceptable to grieve and what isn't. And we are taking that whole paradigm and just shifting it right on its head and saying, nope, that's not us. That's not what we're doing. We're here to talk about grief and loss. And we say and loss to really encapsulate all of these major significant losses that people go through that feel so invisible and so difficult to talk about, but have an enormous impact on our lives.
That's huge, huge, huge. Because when we look at this bigger picture grief, right? Big G grief, which is related to loss of life, whether that be a human loss or a pet loss, because pet loss is impacts people a lot more than we care to admit sometimes, especially with those companions that have been with us for almost 2 decades, right? And little G grief, and it's not to make it less important, it's just a way to frame these two different sides of it. And little G grief is a non-death related loss. So it sounds like you cover the whole spectrum. And when we look at it from this bird's eye view, people could see how sometimes we don't even recognize we're grieving certain things in our lives. We're not aware of it, but certainly how many people go through divorce, IVF, caretaking, I love that you include the environment there. There's a lot of people that are mourning changes to their environment and places that they've known their whole life. And just the reality of the world we live in, quite frankly, could be very stressful. So helping people navigate that is fantastic. And I'll use myself as an example. I like that you pointed out there's one or two outcomes. You either felt supported during your time of grief or you didn't. And I can vouch that most people did not. When my brother died, my team rallied. I was in the middle of closing a real estate transaction back then. And I remember, the fog kicks in, the dissociation from everything that's happened. It just feels very surreal. And it's difficult to focus on deadlines and all these things when you're still trying to grasp what the heck just happened. So in my case, I got very lucky that my team rallied for me. That made all the difference. As somebody who worked for this company, it made me feel so grateful. And there's so much value in what they did for me and my family during our time of need that I will be forever grateful to them. And think about that multiplied by an entire workforce of employees. That
Millions.
Effect, right? And
yes.
Would you say that it reduces turnover? Have you seen the data in terms of what
Absolutely.
it does to the workspace, right?
Yes. So we have some key data points. One is around turnover. So that's a retention point. The other one is recruitment, cost to recruit a person. So we know that turnover is higher when people are not supported. It costs on average $50,000 to replace a person. So I can tell you that your return on investment is much higher with respect to corporate continuity, corporate knowledge, talent, succession planning. When you work to retain your employees through compassionate leadership, the cost of replacing that person is very high, and it's very costly, not just in terms of recruitment, but also the time to recruit. You're losing key business continuity by doing that, and you're putting your business at risk. The other key data point that we have is around presenteeism and absenteeism. So we know that people who are not well supported in their workplace are at higher risk of burnout, higher risk of physical illness, higher risk of mental illness. All of this puts us at risk for extended sick leave, long-term disability, which is costly. We know the Canadian economy alone, absenteeism costs $16 billion a year.
Wow.
That's an enormous number. I often say to C-suite leaders and executives, not only is this the right thing to do, but it's also the business savvy thing to do. It's the strategic thing to do. So when you're thinking about your business and you're thinking about your strategic goals, we need to apply the same principles of planning and strategy to the inevitability that our employees are going to experience loss.
Absolutely. There's a cost to do this, and there's a cost to not doing this, to not preparing.
Absolutely.
You have to choose which cost you're willing to pay. It's going to be way more beneficial for the company and for the employees and for every human involved all around to go through this
I want to
process.
say one more thing about costs, and I want to bring it back to your example.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're out in your community and you're talking about the company that you used to work for and the way that your team rallied, and you smile and you're filled with love and compassion for them and gratitude because of the way that you were treated, that signals to people, this is a company that I should do business with. There's a reputational benefit to compassionate leadership and compassionate business practices. On the other side, there is reputational risk. Had your company not treated you that way, boy, you'd be saying something very different to your friends and family and community members about that company. And that is a risk to organizations. And I think that we forget that reputational risk is something leaders have control over. They can do something about this. They just need to plan effectively.
I agree. I talk about my company in a way that is authentic because I mean it. I mean when I say that. They rallied around it. They were wonderful. When I look back on my life and that really difficult moment, how everybody showed up for me, that's priceless. That has a value that goes a long way. And you're absolutely right. I have nothing bad to say about this company. In the day and age that we're living, you think about the people that go straight to social media, the visibility that has. And you have one person doing this, then another, and it becomes, like you said, a reputation for the company that they're not supportive, et cetera, et cetera. And that is costly in more ways than one, for sure.
That's right. It is. Yeah.
Amazing. So you have the Mother Love Project, you have Bloomwell Partners, you're working with grief in a very personal capacity and in a professional capacity. What would you say grief has taught you through all these years, from being 18 years old, brand new to it, the shock, to now working to help other people navigate it, how would you say grief has shifted for you, and what has it taught you?
Oh, such a good question. I think, over the last almost 30 years, it's 29 years this year. What I've really realized is grief is complicated. It's not black and white. It's not one thing or the other. It's not just sadness. It's anger and resentment and joy and gratitude and longing. And I spent so many years really running from my grief, like running as fast as I possibly could until it caught up with me. I realize now that I am okay to sit with my grief and to sit with the difficult feelings that I have and just let them come. And it's okay. And I can survive them. And they're not as intense as they were when I was 18 and alone and terrified and overwhelmed by the waves of grief that kept hitting me. Now I really sit with my feelings and I allow those feelings to wash over me, and then I feel okay. And I think my grief has allowed me to connect with people that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to connect with, and, created this beautiful company with Mikkel I wouldn't have been able to, create if I hadn't started the project. And I think it's given me a voice, Nina. I think I felt like I didn't have a voice for such a long time that I couldn't tell my own story, but I can tell my story. And I really feel a responsibility to help other people tell their story too. It's brought me a lot of joy and a lot of, I think, peace that I didn't have. And maybe it's middle age, who knows? It's totally possible. I turned 47 this year and I feel very mature. I think perspective and time has been really helpful, and just so much therapy. Oh man, I have been there for so long, and it just has really helped me, because grief morphs and changes with you as you age and you go through these life transitions, and having children and buying a home and getting married and getting my first job. I did all of these things without my mom. And that breaks my heart. And that's okay that my heart is broken. I sit with that. I honor that. And I think my grief has taught me to give myself grace, because I give people a lot of grace, but I'm very hard on myself. And I think over the last, I would say probably 6 or 7 years, I've really just tried to work on giving myself a lot more grace. So yeah, that's what my grief has taught me.
So beautiful. And I love that you incorporated that grief is not just these sad emotions. There's also plenty of joy and acceptance and grace along the way. I always like to make the distinction that there's that early grief and where it's confusing and everything feels like shards of glass and it can be so stressful. And then with time, it's not necessarily that time heals everything, because you still feel the missing your mother and the wishing she would have been there, and all the longing, all of that is still present. That doesn't really go away. It's more that with time we gain perspective, and with time the shards of glass become, I just had this visual, the pieces of glass on a beach, that they're just smooth and they're almost beautiful. They're like, they become like these little gemstones, and
the rough edges get worn down. Yeah.
Yes. And so something so initially painful has the potential to become something beautiful that helps us gain our voice and share our stories, help other people, et cetera, et cetera. So it sounds like that's what you're doing.
Yeah. I want to say something about the sharp edges.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you that I still have quite a few. And they're probably not as sharp as they used to be, but they're still there. And there are moments, places, sounds, people, pictures, memories, music, where those sharp edges, they come out because it's painful. And I think the past probably 6 or 7 years, maybe 8 years, has really given me an opportunity to recognize what those are and not judge myself for it and not sort of turn away from it, but to really lean in and get curious. Oh, what does that mean? Oh, what's that about? Oh, I'm feeling anxious. Okay, why am I feeling anxious? Okay, let's process that. It's a real process for me because as a kid, I didn't grow up learning how to recognize my feelings. And so now as an adult, I'm having to learn for the first time what that actually means. And I think that my grief is a prism. It's like it's a frame that I am able to look through and go, oh, okay, I feel sad. I feel sad today. Okay, I'm going to sit with why I'm sad. And that's been enormously helpful for my mental health.
I love that. Yes, the shards of glass turning into smooth glass. That's not the point of grief. The point of grief is not to turn them into smooth glass. It happens or can happen with time. But I love that you said, not all of them are smooth. There's still shards of glass that peek through every once in a while.
Yeah.
The difference is you learn to accept and acknowledge them and navigate around them or with them or through them. Thank you for that. I really like that because, again, nuance. Grief is very nuanced. So I'd like to give you a few minutes to say last words, maybe cover something that we didn't talk about or just anything that's in your heart today as we approach Mother's Day. And the floors are all yours.
Thank you. Well, I will say about Mother's Day, such a loaded day, right, for a lot of us. And not just for people who have lost their mothers or are estranged from their mothers, people who are struggling to have children, who have children die. I hold your mother in my heart on Mother's Day. I'm sure that's a difficult day for her too. And, I think it's okay. However you want to spend that day, give yourself permission to spend it. Don't feel that you should do this or you should feel that or you should be this way. Like, let's just take that word should out of our vocabulary because it's really damaging and it doesn't serve us. And honestly, it doesn't serve the people around us. I spent years pretending like I was really enjoying Mother's Day when I was dying inside. Yeah. And I can tell you that I wasn't fooling anybody. I'm not a great actress. And everyone around me knew that I was not doing well. But I pretended. I was like, oh, yeah, this is great. This is so much fun. No. So now we don't play that charade anymore. We don't play that game. And we spend Mother's Day, my partner and I, the way that we want to spend it. And that is purposeful and it's intentional. And sometimes during that day, I just have to say to her, I just need a few minutes. I'm just going to go upstairs. I'm going to go to my bed. I just need to peace out for a bit and just be with my thoughts and have let the feelings come if they come. And then I'm okay. And I can go back to whatever we're doing. And I think that really models emotional integrity and emotional authenticity for my children as well. I'm not putting my mask on. I'm not pretending like everything's okay. Like they know when mama is not doing well and that's okay. The other thing that I just want to leave our beautiful listeners with is this idea that grief is a structure like any other structure, and it is informed by and shaped by and a product of, sexism and racism and patriarchy and socioeconomic status, culture, religion, language. The language we use around grief is so profoundly impacted by how and where we grew up and our family structures. And I think we so often talk about grief as very individual. We live in a very individualistic society, so that makes sense. But grief is profoundly social and is shaped by social forces. And so I encourage you to think about your own relationship with grief. And not you, Nina, you know what I mean? Like the royal we.
I do. Thank you.
I know. I know you too. I just say the royal we should royally we think about how grief is shaped by and informed by, our family structure, our culture, our religious beliefs. All of those pieces really culminate in how we deal with grief and loss in our own life. And the access to resources that we have, the access to support. How do we pay for therapy? How do we pay for medical care if you live in the United States or elsewhere? We don't pay for medical care, but you know what I mean. And race and socioeconomic status and culture, all of these forces shape the way that we experience grief and loss. And it's so profound. And I don't think that we talk about it enough. So that's my soapbox that I'm on today. So thank you for letting me get that off my chest.
Thank you for sticking that into. No, that's a very, very important point. A while ago, I did an episode called "What's Your Grief Bias?" precisely because of that. There's a lot of expectations for grievers to get back to normal and come back when you're not sad anymore. And, I miss the old you and all these things, even within the grief community. And I love that you say grief is impacted by all these other elements and external forces, if you will, outside of our own control, because that impacts our ability to move through grief. So thank you for bringing that up. Context is everything, and access to being resourced during a time of need is everything, and that is something that is not talked about enough. So thank you for bringing that, and thank you for doing your part, because you are helping people navigate grief through Bloomwell Partners and through the Mother Love Project. So very timely episode. If you are listening and you're having a hard time this week as we approach Mother's Day, we see you, we hear you. Janet has some incredible resources that can definitely benefit. So check out the show notes, click on her information, connect with her. She's an incredible, beautiful soul and a light and a wonderful person all around. And I believe you work with any type business, correct? Through
any type of business.
Okay.
Absolutely. Private sector, public sector, not-for-profit. We work with everyone.
Perfect. So if any of these messages resonated with you and it's something that you can find value, which, you should, because we're dealing with humans, anything that has to do with humans, employees, navigating life, I guarantee you sit down with somebody long enough, you will find their grief. So having these tools and empowering each other in workspaces and in personal spaces is priceless. So check out Bloomwell Partners. Check out the Mother Love Project. And Janet, I thank you so much for being here. You are wonderful. And as a final question, what would Janet today tell Janet on her graduation day?
Oh, boy. Finishing with a doozy. Janet today would tell Janet on her graduation day, you're safe. You're going to be okay. It's going to be okay. I'll give you a hug. I know you feel like everything is shattered into a million pieces, but you're not shattered into a million pieces. You just feel that way. And you're not always going to feel like that. It's going to get better.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Janet. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Nina, for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
That's it for today's episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Grief and Light podcast. I'd also love to connect with you and hear your thoughts and your stories. Feel free to share them with me via my Instagram page at Grief and Light, or you can also visit griefandlight.com for more information and updates. Thank you so much for being here, for being you, and always remember, you are not alone.